was one of the most anticipated speeches in Washington for years, and it delivered on expectations. The Israeli Prime Minister on Capitol Hill addressing members of the United States Congress this week and challenging the U.S. President, Barack Obama, on his efforts to secure a nuclear deal with Iran.
This deal won't be a farewell to arms. It would be a farewell to arms control. And the Middle East would soon be crisscrossed by nuclear tripwires. A region where small skirmishes can trigger big wars would turn into a nuclear tinderbox.
President Obama quickly defended his position and shot back at Netanyahu from the White House.
On the core issue, which is how do we prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, which would make it far more dangerous and would give it scope for even greater action in the region, the Prime Minister didn't offer any viable alternatives.
What does it all mean for the ongoing talks over Iran's nuclear program, and where does it leave the relationship between the leaders of longtime allies and friends, the United States and Israel? Well, joining me now is Hilary Mann-Leverett. She is the incoming visiting scholar at Georgetown University. She's also a former U.S. negotiator with Iran and is the author of Going to Tehran, Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic of Iran. Hilary, nice to have you here again.
Thank you.
Looking at the speech, full of alarmist rhetoric, in the words of the Guardian newspaper, the intention was to scare American politicians to death. What did you make of it?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, Prime Minister Netanyahu succeeded, but he's had a lot of practice in this. You know, he first addressed Congress and in a very similar way, saying that Iran was going to become the world's nuclear terrorist state back in 1996. So for nearly 20 years, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been coming to Washington, trying to scaremonger Americans against the threat of either a nuclear Iran, or back in 2002, he was one of the leading voices to go to Congress to give testimony about how Iraq Saddam Hussein was deploying nuclear weapons and what he called these portable mass vehicles to launch these nuclear weapons to annihilate not only Israel, but the world. So he's had a lot of experience doing that. Unfortunately, for my compatriots here in Washington, they seem to fall for it again and again and again, either by, in 2002, building up the case for actual war and invasion of Iraq, or by increasing every year exponentially military sales, military aid. It's not even a sale, it's actually giving it to the Israelis, of the most advanced American weapon systems possible. So the message, what Prime Minister Netanyahu does and some of his Israeli colleagues when they come to Washington is not only to push the United States to continue these very counterproductive military adventures in the Middle East, but is for themselves to get more and more military aid, more and more weapon systems. So I think it was very effective. What we're seeing potentially different now with President Obama is that he doesn't have that much of a choice. He's gone down this road to negotiations, real, serious, intense negotiations with the Iranians. I think in some ways taking a page from my book, which is when these negotiations started after my book came out, that the only way you can really deal with a rising Iran is to have a constructive relationship with it. President Obama is seriously engaged in that prospect, to have a constructive relationship with Iran. He can't just have it by coming to a good agreement with Iran. He's going to need to break crockery and actually tell the Israelis that it's not just a good relationship with Iran, but there will be a different relationship with Israel. That potentially is revolutionary for the United States and could be enormously productive.
So are you saying, though, that if President Obama suddenly adopts a very hard line on these talks on Iran, that it may be seen in some way as, well, you know, maybe the Israeli Prime Minister had a point?
Certainly, I think that my Iranian colleagues will be looking to see whether there's been any change or shift in the American position. And they've seen that before. Back in November, when the interim deal was extended, November 24th, when it was extended, there was some sense, I think, among Iranian colleagues that the United States was forward-leaning, but then pulled back suddenly. And I think there's certainly a concern that both the Israelis and our Saudi colleagues whisper in Secretary Kerry's ear, and then the position changes. So I'm sure they will be looking for that. But for President Obama, he doesn't have much of a choice. Either he goes through with these negotiations and comes up with a deal that could get him the real Nobel Peace Prize that he would deserve, or he's going to have to say, well, you know, I woke up today and I didn't realize until Prime Minister Netanyahu told me that Iran is really this terrorist, Nazi-loving Hitler incarnate. And since I didn't know that, I'm going to change my position. It would be hard for him to do that.
Prime Minister Netanyahu made the point that these talks would lead to a deal that doesn't actually block Iran's path to a bomb. He says it's going to pave the way to Iran's quest for a bomb.
And he should know, because the Israelis, of course, have 200 nuclear weapons, a nuclear arsenal. They're the only ones in the Middle East. They have a monopoly on that. So, of course, he should know what it does take to build nuclear weapons. But Iran is a signatory to the NPT. And I think part of these negotiations, that's the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, which would require Iran to never weaponize its nuclear power program. It is a legal signatory to that. Part of the negotiations, I think, are also to try to entice Iran, incentivize Iran to also sign up to the additional protocol to the NPT, which would, this kind of false story that there's a 10-year sunset clause. The NPT is forever. These restrictions are in perpetuity. And the additional protocol on top of that would, in perpetuity, oblige Iran to allow in very intensive inspections and monitoring. So instead of actually paving the way to the bomb, what it does is it entrenches Iran's legal obligations in the international community to have a peaceful civilian nuclear power program, like most of the other countries in the NPT. Israel is the outlier, not Iran.
How much of the speech to Congress was actually a political speech on the part of the Prime Minister to get votes back home?
Certainly, nobody could accuse Prime Minister Netanyahu of not being a talented politician. He is one of the longest-running prime ministers in Israel. He, I think, will come up against the record of the founding Prime Minister Ben-Gurion, which is quite an achievement politically, so we should never underestimate his political talent. But there is a real difference between Israel and potentially a United States that is looking not to have dominance in the Middle East for an America that's trying to realign its policies. There's a huge difference between Israeli policies and that kind of American policy. That kind of American policy would look at, instead of invading and occupying country after country from Afghanistan to Iraq to Libya to Syria, instead of those kind of military adventures, a new American policy would pull us back, not completely withdraw, but pull us back into more of a balance of power approach where we have constructive relations with all of the important players, including Iran. That is fundamentally at odds with Israel because a good relationship with Iran would constrain Israel. So if, in the words of the former Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak, the problem with Iran is not that they would bomb Israel. The problem with Iran is that they would make the Israelis think twice the next time they wanted to invade Lebanon or bomb Gaza. That's good for the United States. To constrain the Israelis that way, where they would have to think twice, is good for us, but it certainly puts us at loggerheads with Israel, and that's not just a Netanyahu problem.
Okay, Hillary, I've got a few seconds left. Sure. What does this do to United States-Israeli relations? The Financial Times is saying that Israeli influence is waning in the United States, in Washington. It's not specifically attributing that to this speech. It's saying that it's just another nail in that coffin, that the influence is dropping, it's diminishing.
Well, people said the same thing when the former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir went head-to-head with the first President Bush 41 in the early 1990s. And yes, Shamir lost that election when he went head-to-head with Bush. But again, the U.S. relationship with Israel grew exponentially in terms of military aid to Israel, exponentially. Tens of billions of dollars in economic and military aid flowed from the United States to Israel after that so-called breach. So even though, yes, I think we're in a tense moment in U.S.-Israel relations, we should not underestimate the ability for Israel and its friends here to continue to cement that relationship financially and militarily.
Hillary Mann-Leverett, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.